Cybertal back with you. We're going to continue our series of looking at some of the previous games that Nepomniachtchi and Carlsen played before their World Championship match. As is somewhat well known, Nepomniachtchi actually went into the contest against Carlsen with a lifetime plus score. One of the few people with a statistically significant amount of games with a plus score against Carlsen. Now, some of the games took place when they were children or teenagers. The first game we looked at took place when they were both 12. This game, a little bit older, they were both 14 at the time. But at this point, they're both 2,400. I completely disagreed with the people that completely disregarded these games. I don't think the game should be given absolute weight. I didn't think Nepomniachtchi was the favorite going into this match. But I think the games actually were somewhat indicative of some potential pathways to victory for Nepomniachtchi. And we'll look at it in this game. So Nepomniachtchi was white here. E4, his favorite move. C5. We know of Carlsen today as this monolithic grinding machine that just takes these technical positions and grinds someone's soul into dust with these perfect technical moves. But when he was younger, he was coming up through the ranks as an attacking demon. Most of his early games that he was most well known for are savage attacking efforts. The most famous was a game against Zipka Ernst, where he played a beautiful sacrifice in a Caro-Kann. So playing the Sicilian for Carlsen, of course he played it against Caruana in their match, but he played it for slightly more positional channels. When he was younger, he was playing the Sicilian looking for a fight. C3, so this is the bane of every Sicilian player's existence, and I say that as a lifetime Sicilian player. It's when you play the Sicilian, presumably you're looking for a fight, and that's why I still play the Sicilian. It's hard to find chances against the C3 Sicilian if you're playing against an opponent that doesn't want there to be an interesting game. So the struggle looking for lines where I can get an interesting game has been my lifetime goal against the C3 Sicilian. There are some ways, and I include them all in my repertoire that I can switch out back and forth, but it's still an annoying opening. D5, this is one of two main ways. Knight F6 is the other. Black takes on this whole... Black takes on provoking the E5 pawn forward, and in return he gets this hole on D5 that he can occupy with this strong knight here. In my opinion, these positions can be a little bit more technical than other positions. D5, I think, just my personal opinion, but there tend to be more positions where black can spice things up with some interesting choices. ExD5, this is quite normal. E5 would be a basic positional error. Basically, this becomes an advanced French, where this light square bishop still has time to get out. D4, and then bishop F5. And then, again, this is just an advanced French, where this light square bishop has had time to get outside the pawn chain before black played E6. This is at least equal for black. This is a very comfortable position, so ExD5 is correct. Queen takes... G6, not usual, but it's not a bad move at all. It's a little bit profligate with time, and sometimes this bishop can end up heading up against the granites of this B2, C3, D4 pawn chain. But it's designed to put pressure on D4, and if black is able to accomplish that, this can be a very commonsensical move. The main lines, there's a couple different ones. Knight F6 is the main move, it seems like, and then here black has two options. E6 is the solid option. This leads to isolated queen pawn structures that you can easily get from other openings. Bishop G4 is probably black's overall soundest and black's best bet to get activity in an interesting game. This is what Kasparov was playing against Deep Blue in their 1997 match. This opening still aged quite well. This is a good way for black to proceed. The spicier way that I sort of like, Bishop G4. This is extraordinarily aggressive from black. Black is just looking to immediately put white's lights out on this D4 square. Black can even follow this up with castling queenside, and this can lead to some extraordinarily interesting positions. It can get pretty sharp and tactical, so if white's prepared, black needs to be prepared as well. But if you can catch white unawares with this opening, you can get some very nice positions. But g6, perfectly fine. Knight a3. To people unfamiliar with the c3 Sicilian, this might seem a little bit strange, but this is quite standard for the opening. The knight, on a black move like cxd4, which is what was played in the game, knight b5, and this wasn't played, which is sort of surprising, but knight b5 is the usual idea behind this. So in this position, because white's played the pawn to c3, this knight doesn't have a natural square. d2 is quite passive for it. So this knight, a3 is its best routing square. It can hop to b5 on black taking on d4, or even c4 can be a useful square for it, where it can go to e3 to attack the white queen. Basically, the knight's going to be more active by going to a3 than d2. Again, another way that the rhyming schoolyard sayings about knights on the rim being grim sort of falls down, I think. Of the sayings that we learn when we were all children, that's the most useless. There's countless examples of when a knight is useful on the rim rather than in the center of the board. And just an example, I'm knight bd2. It's not bad, but this knight on d2 just isn't super strong. Knight a3 is much more ambitious. Before bishop c4 was played, I mean, this is just not really the point of knight b5. Knight b5 is much more normal. So obviously, white's threatening the fork in c7, so black needs to stop that. Knight a6. If queen c5, this actually leads to a very dangerous position. Queen sort of has to take on c3, but white gets a humongous initiative here. White's virtually winning, or near winning. Knight a6 is much safer. Knight f6. And because white chose knight a3, instead of this knight being stuck on d2, clogging up the start square bishop, this knight's on d4, where it's quite strong, well placed. This isn't bad for black. It's probably only a little bit better for white, but this is very comfortable for white, and it's a much easier position to play for white. White has much freer development. This knight on a6 will take some time to get back on route, and white can just follow up with natural developing moves. So bishop c4, not the usual point of knight a3. Bishop a3, so this is some crazy tactical mischief. But this is white's best, and Nepomniachtchi probably saw bishop e3 when he played bishop to c4. At bishop e2, this is just a bad Mora gambit for white. Black is quite solid. The bishop on e2 is very passive for a Smith-Mora gambit. Black can easily play knight f6 and get castled quickly. This is great for black. So bishop e3, the point is, knight f6 is more sort of forced to guard the f7 square. The point is, if black takes an e3, bishop takes f7. Of course, if the king takes, knight g5. And if the king dodges for a move, we insist. So knight a6 is more or less forced to guard the f7 square and get one step closer to castling. Knight b5. Bishop d3 is another way of playing, if white didn't want to go down this route. We play bishop b5 check first to make it so we can take back the queen. Hitting the rook on the corner. And then probably e6 is, or queen e5 is the best move. Something like this. And this looks completely balanced. Subjectively, I prefer white. In these sorts of positions, the queen side majority tends to be a little bit faster, but that's just a subjective preference. I think this is a balanced game. Interesting play to come. Knight b5 is certainly sharper, though. Castle. So far, Magnus is up to the task. Knight a6 is a natural move, it would be quite bad. White simply takes back on d4, and suddenly, white has a huge edge in mobilization. Castle, castle, take. And in this very simple position, white is on the verge of winning. White's got simply threatening to chop on e7. This knight on a6 doesn't make a lot of sense. If black takes a timeout, I mean, probably best is just to take. And then knight c6. And then This rook is threatening to come to d7. This rook can come to a4 to attack these weak pawns. This is gone for black. So castles is more or less forced. Cx d4. This would be a different kettle of fish, because black has taken the time to get his king castle. We have time for knight g4, and we're taking this strong bishop off the board. Black would be fine here. So Cx d4. Knight a6. This is probably not the best. Back here, first off, note that knight c7 isn't great. So f2, then knight g4, and then this position's collapsing for black. This is crushing. If the queen comes to e2 first, then b5. This knight on a8's dropping off. Black's going to have two pieces for the rook. The white king is decisively exposed. Sort of a tactical meme for the mnemonic device for these positions. A lot of times winning the exchange by a knight to c7, that knight's not going to come back again. So you want to make sure that you're not giving up so much to get that knight to c7 in the first place, because here white's giving up a piece and a pawn more or less. So because the knight's not coming out from the a8 square, that's far too much. 64. Knight a6. This is a mistake. It's a natural mistake, but knight f5 is necessary, continuing the initiative. Knight c7. Knight c6, continuing the initiative. Cx d4, and this is an incredibly sharp position, but it looks like black is okay so far. Knight d4 is the best. If queen d3, h5, and this is incredibly complex. Black's got two pieces for the rook, and white has a very exposed king. This is very sharp. It's hard to precisely evaluate this position. What looked like best to me was queen e2, challenging this queen. If castles, bishop e5, attacking this weak pawn. Knight c3, bishop d6, and suddenly, again, this knight is sealed off, so we're planning a move like bishop h3 or bishop f5, winning that knight on a8. And black already has two pawns for the rook, so if he gets that knight back, got the bishop pair, white has an exposed king. This looks very nice for black. Knight a6 just leads to a bad isolated pawn, more or less. Knight c3, this is a mistake, queen b3. In so many of these tactical situations, and especially with kingside castling, the f7 square is the key to the attack. It's the tender square. And here this is no different. White's simply threatening to pile up with moves like knight g5 or castling, taking h6, and then f7 is collapsing. If black plays bishop d7, this might be the best, but castle. And this is a fantastic position for white. White's got the bishop pair. This knight on a6 doesn't make a lot of sense. We're threatening bishop d5. Knight c7 is probably necessary. But then this fails to a simple sequence of winning a pawn. Bishop e6 is an ugly move. And this is an amazing ending for white. These doubled f pawns are truly horrific. There are lots of endings that are technically losing just because of these doubled f pawns. So knight c3, and the difference is black's been able to get his queen away from exposure, and black has time to get this knight to d6 to stabilize everything. Not only will it guard f7, but it'll help hit his bishop on c4 and force white to respond. Queen b6. This is a true mistake. Knight c7 is best. And this would be a fairly balanced position. I still subjectively prefer white, because white does have a nice edge in mobilization, and the c7 knight really isn't terribly good, but black is quite solid. This f5 knight, we can always chop an e3, and suddenly black will have the asset of the bishop pair at least. This is quite nice for black. Queen b6, though. This leads to a horrific ending. The knight a4. So here, the d4, typically isolated pawns are a weakness, or sometimes isolated pawns are a weakness. Here's a situation where the pawn isn't a weakness. Whereas these double b pawns, especially this pawn on b6, these are truly horrific weaknesses. Bishop b3. Taking on taking on b6 first was an option. But it's understandable that Nepomniachtchi didn't want to give Carlsen the bishop pair. That would give him some permanent compensation. Bishop b3. This pawn isn't going anywhere. I prefer this. Knight d5. Probably taking on c8 is best. And then g4, taking the f5 square away. Now white's the one that's got the bishop pair. We've got the extra pawn. It's very nice for white. Subjectively, whenever you can take the bishop pair in an open position, you generally want to default to that unless you can find a concrete reason why you wouldn't want the bishop pair. In open positions like these, the bishop pair is a humongous asset. You can see how this bishop on b3 is extraordinarily strong. It's holding this pawn on a2, hitting this pawn on f7, controlling the square in c4. It's a monster of a piece. 5, so these are all normal moves. Bishop b2, knight d2, bishop c2. This is where Nepomniachtchi starts to drift a little bit. Black does have a certain amount of compensation here. This bishop on g7 is quite strong. Black's got an open a-file where we can aim at this a-pawn. White does need to be precise. Generally, when you're up pawns, you want to be trading off minor pieces. So knight c4 makes a lot of sense here. And there's nothing bad here for white. White's simply up a pawn. There's no minor pieces imbalances anymore. White's just up a pawn. This should be fairly easy to convert. Bishop c2 is just too passive. Rook d8. Rook fa8 is best. And this is something you would see in similar in the Benko gambits. Black has excellent compensation based on this open a-file and this bishop on g7. a3, and then e5. This might seem a little bit counterintuitive because this pawn on d4 is isolated and then theoretically weak, so you might want to attack it. But e5 clears this this long diagonal to be completely open, and this bishop is going to be an absolute monster. Rook x e5, and then rook d5. This bishop is opened up in this diagonal. This bishop on f4 is held to guard this weak knight on d2. Black has a lot of compensation here. I would actually subjectively prefer black here just for the play. Rook d8. It's treating this pawn like it's the main target, but the main target should be the white queen side. Bishop d3, I think a4 is a little bit better, relieving the pressure on the queen side. And suddenly, this open a-file isn't an asset anymore. We've managed to close it down, so now this rook on a6 doesn't look especially pointful anymore. Bishop d3, rook d5, this is a direct error. Rook a4 is better. And then black keeps this rook on the a-file. Again, this a-file is an asset for black. It's part of his compensation for the pawn. So keeping his rook on the open a-file is crucial. Then rook h5, this is just a malfunction from Carlsen. The rook just isn't doing anything on h5. Rook a5 is simply better. Just get the rook back where it belongs. Bishop e2, a4 is a little bit better. Just get your pawns moving. g4, I like this move. In these isolated pawn structures, often a knight on f5 is amazing because it's directly attacking the weak isolated pawn. So a g4 pawn spike controlling the f5 square is often quite nice when you can afford exposing your king. Since the queens are off the board, white has no fear in playing this move. Knight e5, excellent move, targeting f7, blunting out this strong dark-squared bishop. e6, this is an error. Bishop e8 is probably best. And black still has some compensation for the pawn. This isn't going for black at all. e6 is quite passive. Bishop e5. Again, whenever you can, take the bishop pair. Here, this is a way forward for white that involves giving back the pawn, but in return, white gets the bishop pair, and we have this monstrous passed a-pawn. White has a very simple plan of just jamming this pawn as far up the board as it possibly can, and that's going to tie up a lot of black's pieces defensively. And then we can try to make progress on, say, the open d-file, something like that. Looks very nice. Bishop e5 gives up the bishop pair. I'm pretty biased. Whenever you can keep the bishop pair, you tend to want to keep it. Whenever you're able to acquire the bishop pair, unless there's a compelling reason why not. I generally default to taking the bishop pair. It's almost always an asset. 4, bishop e8, b4, a5 looks more accurate, just immediately getting this pawn off the attack, and closing down the A file, getting the majority going. If black continues with a similar exchange sacrifice, the fact that the pawn's on A5 takes it out of attack, and the pawn is still on B2, so the rook on A1 isn't tactically exposed. It's going to take black a couple more moves to collect it, giving white time to develop his own play on the other side of the board. Rook x d4. So this is an excellent practical decision. This position, black's down a pawn, and he's quite passive. This bishop on e8's pretty poor. This bishop on g7 is completely blocked out due to the strong knight on a5. White has a very simple plan of just keeping his queenside pawns pushing up the board. Rook x d4 is a very good practical choice, and I think even at this young age, Carlsen was excellent in choosing the practical decision. He didn't just think in categories of pure evaluation strength. He thought in categories of what would make the most practical sense. In that way, it was very similar to Lasker, in that he wasn't necessarily thinking of the psychology of his opponent, but he was recognizing the psychology of himself. He was looking for positions that were easier to play, where he would be more likely to find his way successfully than his opponent. That's a very underrated criteria. We're human beings playing a human being game, so whatever we can do to make things easier for ourselves is typically better. But here, this is excellent compensation for black. Black's got the bishop pair, white's got these weak pawns in g4 and b4. This is nice. X b4. Probably taking the e5 is better, just getting that strong knight off the board, and then we get rid of this pin. And now this bishop's able to come to c6. If white's better at all, this would be very difficult to win. Black's going to have 2 pawns for the exchange. The bishop will have a very solid spot on c6. This should be nearly impossible for white to convert. So now the knight hops away. Now this knight is creating a lot of threats. Can come to d6. Rook x c4. This isn't necessary. It's sacrificing another exchange, and as a sign of how close black was to the drawing margin to begin with before Rook x a4. Rook x a4 is a clear error. Bishop c6 is better, just holding in place. Now white is winning this f7 pawn. And white is up a pawn here, and he has clear winning chances, but black still has good drawing chances. The bishop versus the knight, that usually favors the bishop. Black has a pass c pawn with which he can create counterplay. This game isn't over. Rook x c4 is just sort of too much. Now, black is still very solid, but it's 2 exchanges, and in a wide open position like this, it's not like the rooks are lacking for scope. If the position were more closed up, and we had the same material balance of 2 bishops and 2 pawns, that would be perhaps a different story. But the position's too wide open for the rooks. h5. h6 would be a little bit more tenacious. When you're facing rooks like this, typically you want to keep the files as close as possible. This is doing white's work for him, opening the files up. And then rook comes behind the passed pawn. That's good technique when you're fighting against passed pawns. Check, cutting the king off in the 7th rank, also good technique. e3. This is a little bit more direct, but at this point, there's several different ways to the goal. And here, Nepomniachtchi chooses the most practical approach, which I completely agree with. Again, whenever possible, choose the most practical approach. If there's 2 ways of winning, and one is easier and less difficult to calculate, go with the easiest and less difficult way. A point on the score sheets weighs the same no matter how you achieve it. This completely robs black of any counterplay. And then, after f5, Carlsen resigns. We're just going to pick up d5, then come to e6, and the rest of the game is gone. This game took place when they were both 13, I believe. And it's easy to say that this is a game from which they were children, so it doesn't have any weight. But I sort of disagree. I think even in this game, you can see the contours of Nepomniachtchi handling a non-standard, complicated position a little bit better than Carlsen. And that's sort of continued into their older games, and we'll look at that in the next game that we do in this series. In terms of evaluation of endgame positions and positional structures, and more quiet positions, or just pure evaluation, I think Carlsen is the best of all time. But in terms of pure calculation, I don't think he's the best of all time, and I think Nepomniachtchi certainly, in some of their games from their youth and later, is certainly able to keep up with Carlsen just in terms of pure calculation and vision and creativity and attacking play. And if Nepomniachtchi were able to guide the match into positions like that, I think we would have seen perhaps a much different outcome. But very nice game. We're going to continue with the series with the next game. This will be a much more recent game, and it's the game that convinced me that Nepomniachtchi had a real chance against Carlsen. So we'll take a look at that in a bit.